Hello YouTube. In this video I'm going to outline a couple of views in metaethics that embrace true contradictions. So just to give a bit of background, let's start with the landscape of contemporary metaethics. It's fairly common to claim that some moral judgments are true and some moral judgments are false. So we can think of these sorts of theories as classical truth theories. Realists, relativists, constructivists, quasi-realists, they all endorse this view. Then there are two influential minority positions. According to error theorists, all moral judgments are false. Moral judgments presuppose that there are objective moral properties, but there are no such properties, so all moral judgments are false. Moral discourse is completely defective in the same way that talk of witches is defective. According to non-cognitivists, or at least some non-cognitivists, moral judgments are neither true nor false. Moral judgments express non-propositional states of mind, like attitudes, which, strictly speaking, can't really be true or false. So when I say that slavery is wrong, this is basically the same as saying boo to slavery, which, if I say boo to slavery, that's not something that you can evaluate for truth or falsehood. It's just an expression of my feelings. So in contemporary metaethics, there are these classical truth theories, according to which some moral judgments are true, other moral judgments are false, but never both. There are error theories, which say that all moral judgments are false. And then there are gap theories. So moral judgments are truth-value gaps. They're neither true nor false. Now, I have a few videos on this channel about dialetheism, the view that there are true contradictions. And with this view in mind, we can identify two theories that as yet have been undeveloped in contemporary metaethics, moral dialetheism and moral trivialism. I take these names from Jason Dockstadter's article, Tiantai Metaethics. So according to moral dialetheism, some moral judgments are both true and false. According to moral trivialism, all moral judgments are both true and false. So the moral dialetheist says that there are some true contradictions within the moral domain. The moral trivialist says that, like all moral contradictions are true. So these can be thought of as sort of non-classical truth theories. Some or all moral contradictions are true. In principle, any view on which there are moral truths could be, dialetheist or trivialist. This kind of moral contradictions are open to realists, relativists, constructivists, quasi-realists, among others. Okay then, let's begin then with the more moderate kind of moral dialetheism. So this is the idea that there are some moral judgments that are both true and false. So we might say that there are some actions that are both good and not good. There are some things that both ought to be done and ought not to be done in the same way, in the same respect. Now, it's worth noting that the moral dialetheist might hold fairly conventional moral views in general. The moral dialetheist only needs one moral contradiction. But why should we think that there are any moral contradictions at all? So a little while ago, I uploaded a video called The Incoherence of Morality, in which I discuss some reasons to think that morality might be inconsistent. I framed this as an argument for moral anti-realism, but if that's supposed to be an argument for moral anti-realism, that presupposes that there can't be moral contradictions. So the summary of the argument I gave is basically this. There are many moral dilemmas that result from a conflict between consequentialist intuitions and deontological intuitions. So in consequentialist moral theories, the moral status of an action is determined entirely by its consequences. In deontological theories, the moral status of an action depends on the intrinsic nature of the action, such as whether the action conforms to a set of rules. There are certain actions that ought not to be done, regardless of how good the consequences of the action might be. Now, both of these theories seem to capture something about how we think about morality, yet at the same time, both of them together, they each generate very counterintuitive results, and they are incompatible. And nobody has yet developed a moral theory that is generally regarded as capturing all of our moral intuitions. So this is this is where the debate is, right? There's a great deal of debate between these two traditions. For instance, consequentialist theories tend to run into trouble with the following sorts of cases. Suppose that there's a healthy person, who enters hospital for a minor ailment. At the same time, there are 5 people close to death whose lives could be saved if we take the organs of the one healthy person. And we can stipulate that if we save these 5 lives, each person will go on to live for as long as the single healthy person would have lived. Should we kill the one person to save the 5? Most people find that totally repugnant. Indeed, even if we modify the scenario so that we're merely maiming one person to save 5, most people would still say, no, that's repugnant. What we're inclined to say is something like, look, people have rights, like rights to decide what to do with their own bodies. Those rights cannot be violated no matter how significant the costs of protecting those rights might be. And yet, of course, if we make the numbers big enough, attitudes tend to shift. So, killing one person to save 5, that's not acceptable. But killing one person to save 5 billion, you're really not going to kill one person to save, if like 5 billion lives are on the line, you're really not going to kill one person to save 5 billion. Most people would find that rather more tempting. So the point is, we have these kind of conflicting intuitions. Sometimes we find ourselves reasoning along consequentialist lines. Other times we find ourselves reasoning along deontological lines. And then there are cases where we're just kind of unsure. So the classic trolley problem is maybe an example of this, for some people at least. So, a trolley is headed down the tracks towards 5 people. You could pull a lever which will switch the trolley to another track where one person will be killed. In that situation, do you pull the lever? Do you shift the trolley so that it kills one person to save the 5? A lot of people, when they're presented with that scenario, they feel tempted towards both options. They're not sure. So, intuitions seem to kind of pull us in these two incompatible directions. Now, many philosophers hope that we will come up with convincing arguments for one theory or the other, or maybe we will develop some sort of hybrid theory that captures our intuitions without facing any significant theoretical problems. But after hundreds of years of work on moral philosophy, there's still not that much hope of developing a consensus anytime soon. And we might wonder whether this is all just going to be futile. So in his paper, War and Massacre, Thomas Nagel summarizes the challenge here. He says, there may exist principles, not yet codified, which enable us to resolve such dilemmas. But then again, there may not. We must face the pessimistic alternative that these two forms of moral intuition are not capable of being brought together into a single coherent system. And so this is the key point, right? So here are 3 claims, 3 propositions, all of which are very controversial, but I think it's fair to say all of which are taken seriously by many philosophers, or at least some philosophers. So, first, consequentialism and deontology are, in some sense, they are fundamental aspects of moral thought. Ordinary moral thought seems to be based on both consequentialist and deontological principles. Like our moral intuitions seem to be driven by both of these ways of thinking. Second, consequentialism and deontology are incompatible. Yes, there are going to be a wide range of cases where they converge, where we make the same assessment on the basis of these ways of thinking, but there's going to be some cases where they issue conflicting judgments about what we ought to do. Maybe the best consequentialist theory tells us to pull the lever in the trolley case, while the best deontological theory tells us to refrain from doing that. There are going to be cases where they just issue conflicting judgments. So these theories cannot be sort of brought together into a consistent system. And then third, consequentialism and deontology are ineliminable from moral thought. We could, of course, propose a pure consequentialist theory or a pure deontological theory, but that might well involve such a radical conceptual revision that we would no longer be dealing with morality, or it might just not really be psychologically possible for humans to fully prune either one of these modules from their moral thinking. Okay, so as I said, obviously every one of these claims is controversial, but it's not like they're crazy, right? And the point is that if these three claims are true, then it looks like morality is going to be inconsistent. So again, you can check out my earlier video for a more detailed argument here. I hope I've said enough to communicate the basic idea, right? The basic idea is morality ineliminably involves reasoning along both consequentialist and deontological lines, but consequentialism and deontology are incompatible. So there's going to be some cases where it's both true and not true that you ought to do X. Now, as I said, I presented this as an argument for moral anti-realism. And of course, this argument for moral anti-realism presupposes that there could not be true contradictions in the moral domain. But the moral realist doesn't need to assume this. If the moral realist is open to dialetheism, she might take this argument as an argument for the existence of moral contradictions rather than as an argument for the non-existence of moral values and moral duties. The point of this argument is well, morality is inconsistent, but you're only going to get an anti-realist conclusion if we're assuming that morality can't be inconsistent, right? We're assuming there can't be these inconsistent values and duties. But maybe that's the way the world is. Maybe there are true contradictions, in which case we can just embrace the inconsistency of morality. This becomes an argument for moral dialetheism rather than an argument for moral anti-realism. Okay then, just a quick advert. If you like my videos, you can sign up to my Patreon. I have a bunch of bonus videos on there, so if you want to see more of me, then sign up to that. And of course, the money helps a lot as well. I also have a PayPal if you want to just, throw me some cash. It's obviously very much appreciated. These videos do take quite a long time to put together, and so, if you can help out, I do appreciate it. Okay, let's move on then. So some other reasons why you might think that there are moral contradictions. So there's another classic, much older argument for moral anti-realism, which is the argument from disagreement. Basic idea is this. If moral realism were true, and if we had some way to access the moral facts, we should expect that different societies would follow, broadly speaking, the same sorts of moral rules. But across different times and places, we find a wide divergence in moral rules, and it's not really clear how to bring people to agreement, to moral agreement, by appealing to, arguments and evidence. I mean, in some cases, different moral views are based on empirical disagreements. Let's say, for instance, that Verity opposes the death penalty because she believes that many innocent people will be wrongfully executed, while Sidney approves of the death penalty because he believes that it's very, very rare that innocent people are ever convicted. This is an empirical disagreement. It's a disagreement about the reliability of the justice system. Verity doesn't really trust the justice system. Sidney does. Both of them are just going to say, well, if somebody has committed a terrible murder, then they basically do deserve to be executed. They deserve it. But now there's just a question of whether we're going to be able to reliably identify the people who have committed these terrible crimes. Verity says we can't, Sidney says we can. That's an empirical question. But then there's Delia. Delia opposes the death penalty just because she says it's just wrong to take human life. It's wrong to kill people, regardless of what they've done, regardless of how sure we can be whether they're guilty. Now, what we have here is a disagreement in fundamental values. This kind of conflict in fundamental values is much more difficult to resolve. We can see what kind of evidence Sidney could use to convince Verity. Like, if Verity is skeptical of the reliability of the justice system, then we can see the sorts of empirical studies that Sidney might need to do in order to convince Verity to have more trust in it. But how is he going to reach Delia? I mean, what kind of evidence, what kind of arguments can you use if this is just like a basic principle that Delia has, that she's just, look, I just think it's wrong to take life, period. Then that's going to be much harder to bridge that gap. And of course, the point is that when we look across different cultures, we do seem to find that a lot of moral disagreement, although some of it is a matter of empirical disagreements, a lot of moral disagreement seems to rest on these sort of deep disagreements in values. So anyway, J.L. Mackie states the basic argument from disagreement as follows. He says, the actual variations in moral codes are more readily explained by the hypothesis that they reflect ways of life than by the hypothesis that they express perceptions, most of them seriously inadequate and badly distorted, of objective values. Okay, and when we think about the debate between consequentialism and deontology, arguably that bottoms out in these sorts of disagreements in values. So, as I said, this is one of the classic arguments for moral anti-realism. But again, you might think, okay, but this is perhaps, if we take this as an argument for anti-realism, we're ignoring one of the options here, because the moral dialetheist has a fairly unique account of disagreement that allows her to retain moral realism. According to the moral dialetheist, when we have these situations where there's a conflict in fundamental values, it might just be that both positions are correct. So it might be that consequentialism is both true and false. Maybe it's both true and false that in certain circumstances where we can be certain who has committed a crime, they ought to receive the death penalty. So the disagreement here is no longer going to have any force against moral realism. As the dialetheist sees it, the reason why there is this disagreement is precisely because people are detecting contradictory objective values. So, maybe we could appeal to disagreement in that way. Another argument along similar lines appeals to the phenomenology of moral dilemmas. So the kind of case I've just talked about with moral disagreement, that's like a kind of external disagreement, right? We have moral disagreement between different people. But sometimes there's situations where there's almost a kind of internal disagreement. Sometimes there are these cases where it seems as if, I, just as a single individual, face a kind of internal moral conflict. I feel as though moral duty is pulling me in two incompatible directions. Maybe the standard trolley case is an example of that for some people, right? So maybe there are some people who just have this feeling that, I ought to pull the lever to save the 5, but also I ought not to pull the lever. I like both of those. It's like I should do both of them. So the situation feels impossible to resolve adequately. Whatever course of action you take, there's going to be a sense of guilt, a sense that you've done something wrong, that you should have done something else. The moral dialetheist takes this phenomenology at face value. There are cases where moral duty really does pull us in two incompatible directions. The reason why it feels as if you ought to both pull the lever and refrain from pulling the lever is because it really is the case that you ought to pull the lever and refrain from pulling the lever. What's happening is you are just confronted with a moral contradiction. So that's maybe another point that the moral dialetheist might make. So as you've seen, moral dialetheism, one reason why this might be appealing is it allows moral realists to resist some of the standard anti-realist arguments. Now, it's also worth noting that from some anti-realist points of view, we might actually expect moral contradictions. So suppose, for instance, that we accept some sort of moral constructivism. A simple form of constructivism would say that there are moral truths, but these truths are not fixed by mind-independent moral properties. Rather, the moral truths are what follow from our fundamental values, plus the descriptive facts about the world. Now, morality is going to be objective to the extent that I might be incorrect about what my fundamental values are, and I might be incorrect about what follows from those values, or about the best way of realizing those values. So let's say, for instance, that I take myself to value maximizing happiness. I think that my only concern, the only thing I care about morally, is maximizing happiness for all. So, I'm going to then identify as some sort of utilitarian. Well, first of all, it could be that my self-description is mistaken. Perhaps the right sorts of arguments would reveal that there are things that I value beyond mere happiness. Nozick's experience machine argument, perhaps. I just haven't thought about that argument very carefully. Maybe I haven't encountered it before, but like if I were presented with the argument, maybe I would realize, oh, wait a minute, there are things that I value beyond just maximizing happiness. Second, it might be that I'm mistaken about what are the effective methods for maximizing happiness. I might think that a particular action would maximize happiness when in fact it wouldn't. So through reasoning and argument, I can come to discover what propositions are actually supported by my basic values. And these are going to be the moral truths from my point of view. Given the sort of basic values that I have, certain propositions will follow from that, and those are going to be the moral truths. And that's partly a matter of discovery. It's not like I just invent that stuff. So anyway, this is, again, it's a kind of naive constructivism. The point is, though, is that if we endorse this view, then shouldn't we expect that there would be moral contradictions? I mean, people frequently make commitments that entail contradictions. Indeed, one of the reasons why we engage in reasoning and argument is because we want to uncover such contradictions. Now, if you're a moral realist, moral beliefs should be guided by facts in the mind-independent world. And maybe you have some reason to assume that the mind-independent world is not contradictory. You have some reason to think that there are no true contradictions in the mind-independent world. So when a moral realist uncovers a contradiction, she's going to have to modify her moral beliefs. Contradictory moral beliefs aren't going to be, they can't match the consistent independent moral facts. But for the constructivist, these independent moral facts drop out. So there's no longer any independent constraint that imposes consistency. My fundamental commitments might well entail a contradiction, and there's no independent standard that can be used to judge that my fundamental commitments are incorrect. There's no independent standard that's going to force consistency onto the moral truths. Now, of course, what I've described here is a very naive form of constructivism. There are other constructivisms, some of which will have ways of ruling out contradiction. And it does seem clear that for most people, consistency is an important feature that they want for their moral beliefs. But, I mean, even there, consistency is only one value among many. It might not always trump every other consideration. Maybe it's just one factor to be considered when trying to find the moral principles that best accommodate our moral intuitions. So anyway, the general point here is just that, firstly then, we've seen that there are ways in which a moral realist might use moral dialetheism to resist certain anti-realist arguments. And then secondly, maybe there are some metaethical views where actually, moral contradictions are just, not even that surprising, right? Like maybe we should just expect, if the right account of moral truth is some sort of constructivist account, then maybe you would just expect there to be cases where a certain moral proposition turns out to be both true and false. So, with all of that said then, let's turn to some objections. Now, of course, one obvious line of argument is that you could make a general objection to dialetheism, to the very idea that there could be true contradictions. I'm not going to address those general objections to dialetheism. I've talked about dialetheism at length in other videos, so let's just assume that dialetheism is at least on the table and consider some more specific objections to contradiction in the moral domain. So second sort of objection then is that in the context of moral philosophy, the problem is that if we accept moral dialetheism, then that's going to force a radical change in our worldview, including basic logical principles. If we accept moral dialetheism, then at the very least, we're going to have to replace classical logic with some sort of paraconsistent logic. So our basic principles of reasoning are going to have to change. because in classical logic, if you have a contradiction, then everything follows, and we don't want that. Well, most people don't want that. Okay, we're going to have to replace classical logic with some sort of paraconsistent logic. But then the claim will be, look, we shouldn't change logic for the sake of like preserving moral intuitions. Logic should constrain moral reasoning, not the other way around. Even if there are good reasons to modify logic, those reasons are not going to come from the moral domain. Now, of course, one obvious response here is just, look, there are many independent arguments for dialetheism, and some of these arguments are from the logical domain, right? I mean, the most influential arguments for dialetheism relate to resolving semantic paradoxes like the liar paradox. And I mean, we talk about like needing to replace classical logic with a paraconsistent logic, but paraconsistent logics have now been developed in detail. So for anybody who's already motivated to accept dialetheism for independent reasons, this worry is unlikely to have much force. We're not changing logic for the sake of morality. We already have a case for dialetheism. The question is just whether true contradictions are limited to cases like the semantic paradoxes, or whether they can be found in other domains. And then if that's your point of view, you might argue that, look, moral contradictions are just merely one among many cases of contradictions. It's also worth keeping in mind that moral dialetheism in itself might not really be that much of it might not involve particularly radical changes to our worldview. So as I noted earlier, the moral dialetheist might be very conservative in general. Maybe they think that moral contradictions arise only in very specific contexts. Indeed, moral dialetheism doesn't even seem to be in that much tension with common sense, insofar as, most ordinary people probably don't have any particular view on this one way or the other. We might be driven to moral dialetheism by the attempt to preserve aspects of common sense morality, like the experience of irresolvable moral dilemmas. And so you might say, well, like maybe moral contradictions only occur in sort of relatively unusual cases. So even if, strictly speaking, the correct logic for, reasoning is going to be some sort of paraconsistent logic, it might well be that we can kind of reason as if classical logic were true in the majority of cases. Okay, so next there is a practical objection. One of the primary goals of morality is to guide behavior. I use moral reasoning to work out what to do. If there were a true moral contradiction, it couldn't guide behavior. I mean, let's say I'm wondering whether to do something. I'm wondering whether to do X. And then the moral dialetheist comes along and says, well, you ought to do X, and it's not the case that you ought to do X. Well, that's not going to help me decide whether to do X. Okay, so ought I to do it or not, right? I mean, I need to know. I need to know what to do. Part of the reason why I'm engaging in moral thinking is to figure this out. So the problem with moral contradictions is that they're going to make morality inapplicable in practical situations. Now, there's a couple of worries about this sort of response. First of all, if we're assuming a realist point of view on morality, at least, then why should we expect that morality would fulfill this goal? For the moral realist, moral values are independent of us. It would, of course, be very convenient if the moral facts were such that they were always applicable in guiding behaviour. But what could be the a priori guarantee that the world is going to be kind to humans in this particular respect? There are many ways in which the world is imperfect. Perhaps this is just one of them. So perhaps one of the ways in which the world is imperfect is that there are cases where, we're just unable to do what we ought to do. And, there's all sorts of reasons why we might be unable to do what we ought to do. But maybe one of the reasons why we're sometimes unable to do what we ought to do is because what we ought to do is contradictory, and we can't behave in contradictory ways. Maybe the world just kind of sucks, and we end up in situations where morality pulls us in these two incompatible directions. And then, what ought we to do? Well, we're not going to be able to resolve between those two options at the very least. But second, suppose that we have a convincing reason to think that morality must always guide our behaviour. In itself, this doesn't rule out moral contradictions, because those contradictions may be limited to cases that we have no control over or that we're never going to encounter. So it might be that moral contradictions only arise in the sorts of scenarios that you find in very outlandish thought experiments where conditions are very different from how they are in the actual world. Maybe this is sort of to do with the fact that moral principles are sort of based on the way the actual world is, but moral principles also have this kind of universal, they're like a totalizing feature where it's just in the nature of these principles that they apply to any possible situation. So, we have these principles that are like grounded in the way the actual world is, but they apply to any possible situation, so situations that are very, very different from the actual world, and maybe there's something about that ends up leading to contradictions. Now, of course, moral contradictions are not going to be limited in this way if the source of moral contradictions is something like the conflict between consequentialist and deontological modules, as I discussed earlier. But that's only one argument for moral contradictions. There are other arguments. So anyway, the point, though, is that what would need to be shown for the practical objection to go through is not just that there are scenarios where it is both true and false that X ought to be done, but that these scenarios are going to obtain in the actual world. I mean, if I never find myself in such scenarios, then contradictions don't actually pose any threat to behaviour guidance. So here's an example. Suppose that I promise Verity that I will clean her house while she's sleeping. I'm doing this in exchange for a favour. And then I also promise Sydney that I'm going to just stay away from him. We've had a previous altercation. Sydney now despises me. I don't want to cause any further problems, so I make a promise. I'm just going to stay away from you. Now, we might think these promises generate obligations. So I'm obligated to enter Verity's house to fulfil the promise. But it's clearly not the case that I'm obligated to enter Sydney's house. Indeed, I ought not to enter Sydney's house. Now suppose that we're living in a universe where, due to a strange quirk of biology, people occasionally spontaneously fuse. So what happens is that in this world, when people go to sleep, they float around in the air during their sleep. And if they contact each other in this state, they merge into one person, where this new person retains many of the characteristics of previous people. Okay, now suppose that this is what has happened to Verity and Sydney. They've both floated around in the air while they were sleeping, they've contacted, they've fused. Now there's one person sleeping, a fusion of both. The argument can be made, on at least some views of personal identity, that this new person is both Verity and Sydney. And in that case, the argument might be made that there's a moral contradiction here. The contradiction is that I ought to enter Verity Sydney's house to fulfill my promise to clean it, but at the same time it's not the case that I ought to enter Verity Sydney's house, because of course that would break my promise to stay away from Sydney. Now, look, I mean, I'm well aware this is a very controversial reading of this scenario. Many people will argue that our moral principles do not generate any contradiction here, but that's beside the point. The point is hopefully you can see why we might, a moral dialetheist might look at this situation and say, okay, yeah, there's some reason to think maybe there's a moral contradiction here. And the point is if our moral principles did generate a contradiction here, that's not going to present any problem whatsoever for applying those principles in guiding our behaviour, because nobody's ever going to encounter this scenario, at least not without some very radical changes to the way the world works, not without some significantly some surprising technological developments. So, I mean, the fact that there is a moral contradiction in this specific scenario just doesn't seem to matter if what I care about is, okay, how do I apply these principles to guide my behavior in the actual world? Okay, then. A fourth objection to moral contradictions is the queerness objection. This is one of the most influential challenges to moral realism. I have a video on the queerness argument, which I will link in the comments. It was first stated by J.L. Mackie, who puts it as follows. If there were objective values, then they would be entities or qualities or relations of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe. Now, here Mackie is challenging all moral realists, whether they're dialetheists or not. The point is that there's nothing in our account of the way the world is that seems to leave any room for these sorts of properties that moral values appear to be. Moral values have a kind of objective prescriptivity. They tell us what we ought to do. They give us reasons for action, regardless of what our own desires or interests or goals are. But none of the particles or fields or forces or relations postulated by our best sciences have any kind of prescriptive force. So, moral values are really weird. That's basically the worry. Again, you can see the other video for an elaboration of this problem. And this is a worry, as I said, for moral realists in general. But we might think that moral dialetheism is only going to make this problem more acute. Because now, if we're a moral dialetheist, then in addition to whatever exactly was the queerness that Mackie drew attention to, we have to add the additional queerness that moral properties can instantiate true contradictions. And contradictory properties are very strange indeed. Nothing in our everyday perception, nothing in our common sense view of the world, nothing in various fields of empirical science indicates that there are these contradictory properties in the world. I think for a lot of people they'd say, look, it's just hard to make sense of what such properties could even be. How could it be that an action is good and also not good? It's like trying to imagine a box that's both occupied and also completely empty. We can't even picture this. You can't even imagine that. It's just unintelligible. This is what some people might say. This contradictory queerness is maybe not so much a problem for constructivists or relativists or people on the more anti-realist side like that, because as we noted earlier, it's there's nothing queer in the idea that people might commit themselves to inconsistent values. But the queerness argument was never directed to constructivists or relativists or whatever in the first place. It was an argument against moral realism, and the point here is that if a moral realist embraces contradictions, then that's only going to make the queerness argument more threatening. That's the idea. So what might we say in response to this? Well, maybe there's a way of kind of turning this point on its head, because, we might think, look, let's say we take seriously Mackie's queerness argument. We think that there is something queer about properties that, are objectively prescriptive, properties that, out there in the world that tell us what we ought to do. Well, given that moral properties are metaphysically queer anyway, right, given that moral properties are so radically different from the other sorts of properties postulated within our best theories, why shouldn't they be contradictory? It's not surprising that moral properties would have features that are not found in the properties postulated by common sense and science. Maybe the very queerness of moral properties, maybe the very difference that Mackie identifies between moral properties and other sorts of properties accounts for why we find contradictions in the moral domain, but not in these other domains. So by analogy, compare abstract objects such as numbers. Abstract objects are different from concrete objects in various respects. For instance, they are non-spatial and non-temporal. They do not exist within space-time. And we might find this feature of abstract objects to be metaphysically queer. Well, then suppose we identify some other feature of abstract objects that is also metaphysically queer. So abstract objects do not enter into causal relations. Nothing brings them into existence and nothing can take them out of existence. Now, initially, we might worry that this strengthens the queerness objection. abstract objects are even stranger than we initially thought. But another way to look at it is that, well, if we grant that abstract objects have this queer property X, then it's not surprising that they might also have some other queer property Y. Once we grant that abstract objects are a completely different kind of thing from the objects of ordinary experience, it's not particularly surprising when we start identifying a whole bunch of other queer features of them. Indeed, notice that the non-spatiality, non-temporality of abstract objects arguably explains why it is that they are non-causal. So those queer properties are all connected, and so there's no. When we identify that abstract objects are non-causal, there's not really any further metaphysical problem. Maybe the same is true in the moral domain, right? Maybe it's that, moral properties are queer in a whole bunch of ways, but like once we've identified, say, objective prescriptivity, that alone shows that moral properties are fundamentally different from the sorts of properties postulated in the sciences, and so it's not surprising that they might also have these other features. Indeed, maybe it's precisely because of the queerness of moral values that moral contradictions can obtain in the moral domain, while we don't find contradictions elsewhere. So maybe we could respond in that way. Okay then, so that is just a brief introduction to moral dialetheism. But now I want to turn to a rather more radical position, moral trivialism. So, moral trivialism. According to moral trivialism, all moral contradictions are true. All moral propositions are both true and false. Now, while some forms of moral dialetheism might be fairly conservative, the same can't be said of moral trivialism. Clearly, this is a fairly radical idea. So why would anybody take this idea seriously? Well, I'm drawing here on Jason Dockstadter's article, Tiantai Metaethics, where he claims, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that word right, actually, Tiantai. I realise I've read it, but I've never actually heard it pronounced. But we're talking about Tiantai Buddhism. I hope I'm getting the pronunciation right. Anyway, Dockstadter claims that although moral trivialism has basically never really been developed in Western philosophy, the view can be found in some Eastern traditions. I do want to just say, I make no assessment here of whether Dockstadter is correct in his interpretation of the metaethical commitments of these of Tiantai Buddhism. I just don't know. Right? Maybe his interpretation is wrong. I'm only interested in seeing how moral trivialism might be defended. Whether anybody has ever really defended it is not important here. So anyway, Dockstadter begins with the story of one of the central figures of Tiantai Buddhism, Siming Zili. Again, I may not be pronouncing that correctly. So anyway, apparently as part of a protest against what he perceived as the public turning away from Buddhism, Zili announced his intention to chop off his own fingers and then set himself on fire, to burn to death. And there was a state official who tried to persuade Zili not to do this on the grounds that self-immolation was a sin, and indeed it would be very indulgent and extremist. It would clearly be contrary to Buddhism's middle way practice. Buddhism, is not something that really should be getting involved with this kind of indulgent extremism, right? So in response to this, Zili just admitted that the act was evil. He admitted it was contrary to the teaching of Buddhism. But he wasn't deterred because, in his view, both Buddha and the devil are the same thing. So, as he put it, what difference is there between the Buddha and the devil? What inequality is there between the correct and the incorrect? Truly, it is because from the beginning the perfect principle possesses the natures of both the Buddha and the devil, that they are not two and yet two and yet not two. The quiddity of the demonic realm and the quiddity of the Buddha realm are said to be one quiddity, not two quiddities. Hence we are able to assert that other than the devil there is no Buddha, and other than the Buddha there is no devil. Where the point here is, it's not just that there are these like two separate entities that each require each other, but ultimately there's no distinction between these entities at all, right? Buddha and the devil are the same thing. Good and evil are the same thing. So how does Tiantai Buddhism arrive at this kind of conclusion? Well, the basic innovation of Tiantai is a development of the two truths doctrine of earlier Buddhist traditions. The two truths doctrine distinguishes conventional truth from ultimate truth. So basically, the distinction is this. The conventional truth about anything is a matter of how that thing appears in a common sense framework. It's how it appears in the world as we ordinarily perceive it and ordinarily represent it. The ultimate truth about a thing is how that thing really is, beyond any particular perspective or convention or conceptual content. Now, the ultimate truth is inexpressible, but there are certain statements, there are certain conventionally true statements that might kind of point towards the ultimate truth. So the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on Tiantai Buddhism gives the following example. So suppose we take the following figure, right? We have the first figure there. You're probably going to say, this is a circle, right? When you just look at that, you're like, yeah, that's a circle. But now let's say we add a bit of context, right? So you can see we've added, the number symbols around this circle. What is it now? Well, now it's the number 0. It's not just a circle, it's the number 0. Okay, let's say we add some more context. We add some letters. What is it now? Okay, well, now it's a circle, it's the number 0, it's also the letter O. And, the number 0 and the letter O are very different things. They're like incompatible. So now it's kind of ambiguous, right? Let's say we add some more context. What is it now? Well, notice that because of the placements of these other circles, what we initially called a circle, is the vertex of a triangle. So it would be perfectly reasonable to point to this circle and say, this is a triangle. If you start adding some more context, maybe you could imagine, imagine like drawing these circles much further apart and adding, drawing circles to fill in the lines of the triangle. And then you could kind of stand at a distance, and what you initially identified as a circle, as something round, it would appear to be sharp. It would appear to be the sharp point of a triangle. So you could say it's sharp and it's not circular. It's not a circle, right? If I draw a whole bunch of circles in a line in such a way that creates a triangle, and then I stand back very far, I can point to the vertex and say that's sharp and it's not circular. So what this is illustrating is that for any given thing, there's going to be a multitude of contexts and perspectives that's going to lead us to assign very different properties to that thing. Any property that we assign to this thing is always going to be, it's always an assignment that's made from some perspective or other, right? So it's true to say that that symbol, that thing, is a circle. But this is only a conventional truth. It's a description of our everyday experience. Ultimately, the ultimate truth, independent of any particular perspective, is that this thing has no intrinsic nature. It is, as the Buddhists would put it, empty. It's neither circular nor not circular. It's neither sharp nor not sharp. Now, to say that this figure is empty is not to say that it is nothing, because nothingness would itself be a determinate content, right? If I say that the circle doesn't exist, for instance, then I'm saying that certain properties are not instantiated. But that's just as determinate a claim as saying the circle does exist. So if I just imagine nothing, then I am actually imagining something very specific and very determinate. When we talk about emptiness, what we're dealing with is it's more like indeterminacy, ambiguity, ineffability. It's like, what is, so it's what if I take this thing, what I'm calling a circle, and I say, what is this circle, independently of any perspective? Is it nothing? Well, no, because nothingness again is something that's only going to be you're only going to represent that from a particular point of view. You're only going to say that certain properties are not instantiated from a certain point of view. Ultimately, there is no distinction between any entity. No entity can be the same as any other entity, nor can any entity be different from any other entity. There is no relation of identity and no relation of distinctness. No predicates can be applied to ultimate reality. And that includes, of course, all of the descriptions I've just given there, because, as I said, the ultimate truth is inexpressible. Anything that is said about the ultimate truth is therefore going to have a kind of paradoxical quality. The conventional ultimate distinction is itself a mere conventional truth. We can only point the way to the ultimate truth. We can't correctly describe it. So, what sorts of statements are conventionally true? Well, there are two classes, at least as within the earlier Buddhist traditions, two classes of conventional truths were identified. First of all, there are the statements that conform to the common sense perspective of our linguistic community. So we have statements like, grass is green, I have two hands, the earth orbits the sun, Frank is hungry, etc., etc., right? These are going to be the conventional truths. Second, there are philosophical theories that point to the ultimate truth, that point us in the direction of emptiness. These are the sorts of philosophical theories that I've just described, the theories that are expressed in Buddhist texts. And these theories are, of course, self-undermining, because the whole point is to move away from the conventional truth, throw away the ladder after you've climbed it. But there are certain philosophical theories that are going to lead to a kind of direct experience of the emptiness of all things, and those are going to count as conventionally true as well. So this is the doctrine of the two truths, right? We have the conventional truth and the ultimate truth. Now, Tiantai's innovation is to add a third truth. The third truth is the identity of conventional truth and ultimate truth. Indeed, it's the identity of any particular conventional truth with the ultimate truth. Any conventional truth, any given conventional truth, just is the ultimate truth. This idea really, actually, you can kind of see it intuitively, that it follows from the characterization of ultimate reality, because if ultimately there are no distinctions, then there is no conventional ultimate distinction. Similarly, there is no distinction between any particular conventional thing and the ultimate reality. There is no distinction between appearance and reality. There is no distinction between, limited perspective and the ultimate reality. Any given conventional truth, therefore, just is the ultimate truth. So recall our example of the circle, right? As we learn more about that circle, we learn more about everything else. The contexts make the circle what it is. Moreover, as we learn more about the circle, we learn it's not just that we learn like no predicate applies to this. We learn that no predicate applies to it, but also that every predicate applies to it. Again, remember the point that emptiness isn't nothingness. So we're not saying like no predicate applies to this. It's going to also be the case that every predicate applies to it. What would the circle look like from all contexts, all perspectives? It would be round and not round, zero and not zero, the letter O and not the letter O, triangular and not triangular, sharp and not sharp. It would be real and not real. So think about how we appraise the circle when we adopt different views about what constitutes a real object. Look at the circle from the perspective of common sense. It's real. It's a real thing. Common sense would say this thing exists. It's part of reality. If you look at it from the perspective of a theory like mereological nihilism, then it's not real, because, look, this circle is composed of a whole bunch of particles, and ultimately, there are no composite objects. So really, there's just a whole bunch of particles arranged circle-wise. There isn't really a circle. So different perspectives are going to lead you to say real and not real. So what makes the circle have any specific property is some specific context and its relation to some other things. What makes the circle the thing that it is all the ways that it is. So what makes the circle what it is are all of these contexts. So what makes the circle what it is just everything else. So there's no way to distinguish the circle from anything else. Any one thing is all things. Any one object is the whole of reality without remainder manifesting as that object. So we start with this conventional truth along the lines of there is a circle or there is a round thing. But then when we investigate what the circle is, what we find is just the whole of reality. And this whole of reality is constituted by an explosion of predicates. Every predicate applies and does not apply. And that just is the ultimate truth. So the conventional truth, this is a circle, is identical with the ultimate truth, the emptiness of all things. So in two truths theory, we have the following claims, right? O is a circle, that's going to be a ordinary conventional truth, right? That's just part of the truths of the linguistic community. O is empty, that's a conventional truth which points us towards the ultimate truth. The intellectual understanding of emptiness will hopefully lead to the direct experience of emptiness, which is going to involve the liberation from any kind of view at all. Conventional truth is a ladder which is thrown away. In Tiantai three truths theory, O is a circle is a conventional truth, but then so is any other description. So I can say, O is an elephant, or O is the will of God, or O is not a circle. So as the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on Tiantai Buddhism puts it, all that is required for a statement about an object to be conventionally true is that it is possible to make it look that way, that it looks that way from anywhere for even one moment. So every statement is conventionally true. And these conventional truths are not abandoned. Whenever I state a conventional truth, the idea isn't that you abandon it. You don't throw the conventional truth away in the direct experience of emptiness or anything like that. Rather, conventional truth is perfected, because the point is that when I state a conventional truth, to fully understand what that is, just is to see the ultimate truth of the emptiness of everything. So, that is the general picture that is given by the Tiantai Buddhists. Now let's turn to morality. So it should be clear how Tiantai Buddhism endorses a sort of general trivialism about the world, and this is going to lead to a moral trivialism. For any given action, there will be perspectives from which any moral predicate you like applies to it. So all moral judgments are conventionally true, and all moral judgments are conventionally false as well. All judgments about what is good or bad, about what we ought to do or ought not to do, about what is permissible or forbidden, all of these, they're all true. And each of these truths is identical with the ultimate reality of the emptiness of all things. What makes goodness what it is everything else. What makes evil what it is everything else. So ultimately there is no distinction between goodness and anything else, or evil and anything else. There is no distinction between goodness and evil. Any given thing is good and not good. Any given thing is evil and not evil. Again, Stanford Encyclopedia provides a nice summary of Tiantai's value theory. A Buddha in the world makes the world all Buddha, saturated in every locus with the quality Buddhahood. I mean, here Buddhahood it's basically goodness, right? A devil in the world makes the world all devil, permeated with deviltry. Both Buddha and devil are always in the world, so every event in the world is always both entirely Buddhahood and entirely deviltry. Every moment of experience is always completely delusion, evil, and pain through and through, and also completely enlightenment, goodness, and joy through and through. That's the idea. Now, all moral judgments are true, all moral judgments are false. Now, of course, most people are doubtless going to find this completely outrageous. All moral judgments are true. So it's true that, for example, it's good to torture children for fun. For many people, this alone will be enough to reject the theory. This is about the best candidate you could ever have for the Morean shift. Classic case. I have videos on Morean arguments. I will link those. I'll link that video in the comments. But basically the point here is, look, the moral trivialist has presented us with an argument which consists of some set of premises, and this leads to the conclusion that it is good to torture children for fun. Should we accept this argument? I mean, well, one way to put this is, should we accept the trivialist's premises? And a Morean is going to say, look, however we fill in those premises, whatever those premises are supposed to be, of course we shouldn't accept this argument. Because the Morean will say that whatever premises are supposed to support this conclusion, those premises are going to be less plausible than the denial of the conclusion. These philosophical premises about perspectives and conventional truth and ultimate truth and all that, they're far less plausible than the claim that no, it is not good to torture children for fun. So we should deny the moral trivialist conclusion and deny the premises of the argument that leads to moral trivialism. We shouldn't accept those premises and conclude that it's good to torture children for fun, because those premises are highly questionable philosophical claims, and they're far less plausible than just denying the conclusion. So basically, what we should argue, we start with the claim, it is not good to torture children for fun, and so we can conclude that at least one of the trivialist's premises are false. Maybe we don't know exactly which one is false, but at least one of them has to be false, because none of those premises is more plausible than the premise that it's not good to torture children for fun. So yeah, that's the kind of Morean shift, right? We take the trivialist's argument and we take the conclusion of it and just deny the conclusion and then deny the premises, rather than accept the premises and then go on to accept the conclusion. Does this Morean shift work? Well, I think moral trivialism introduces an interesting wrinkle here. The Morean objects that the trivialist's conclusion is morally outrageous. But since the trivialist endorses all moral judgments, the trivialist agrees that her conclusion is morally outrageous. So the trivialist agrees that it is not good to torture children for fun. The trivialist agrees that it is deeply evil to think that it's good to torture children for fun. The trivialist agrees that anybody who holds that belief, deserves eternal punishment. I mean, whatever, right? Like, however the Morean wishes to express her moral repugnance with the trivialist's conclusion, the trivialist is going to agree with her. But that makes it a little bit unclear how the Morean point is supposed to have any force against the moral trivialist, because the Morean has merely drawn attention to things that are already part of the content of moral trivialism. So if we think about how, a Morean shift might work, kind of like dialectically at least, it looks like the way this is supposed to work is by pointing to a proposition with which the opponent will disagree, and then we say that this proposition is more obvious than any of the premises used in defense of the opponent's theory. So, like, what the opponent has done is they've said, P1, P2, P3, conclusion, right? And the way the Morean shift works is you say, well, look, you're committed to some proposition, right? But like, denying that proposition is much more plausible than any of those premises. So, at the end of the day, what we have is just a plausibility comparison, right? Do we find these premises more plausible, or do we find, denying this conclusion more plausible? And if we find denying the conclusion more plausible, then, that's obviously what we should do. We deny the conclusion and then deny the premises. So we try to pinpoint some proposition that the opponent rejects, and then we say that proposition is more obvious than any of the premises used in defense of the opponent's theory. And the trouble is that when the Morean cites that it is obviously evil to torture children for fun, obviously evil to say anything else, etc., etc., she hasn't actually given us a proposition with which the trivialist disagrees. So from the trivialist's point of view, it's really not clear how the Morean shift is supposed to have any force. Now, I mean, maybe if you're not a trivialist, then you might assess things differently. But at least from the trivialist point of view, I suppose she's just going to sort of shrug and say, well, look, I already agree with you. I agree with you. It's not just that I already agree with you. It's that my agreement with you is already part of the content of my theory. So how on earth am I, like, why would I then use Why would I use my commitment to this to think that my premises are false? So anyway, that's maybe the response that could be made. Well, I think I'm going to wrap up the video there. I hope you found that interesting, and I will see you next time. So thank you very much for watching. Goodbye, everybody.